Oh,
Welcome to another episode of HSF Conversations. I am Matt Bracey, and I am joined with two individuals from Rambling Ever On. And so you could say this is a sort of hybrid HSF Rambling Ever On Conversations. I'm Matt Bracey, as I mentioned, and this is Aiden Lytle, and this is Phil Lytle, and we have gotten together to discuss the Odyssey, which came out 3 weeks ago or so, and it is almost at this point. It's Monday, August the 3rd. It's almost to the $1 billion mark, which is huge, huge, huge. Perhaps not as huge as Spider-Man's going to be, considering it made almost $1 billion in a weekend, which is unheard of. But nevertheless, um, the Odyssey has been a movie event of the summer, and as Christians who care about engaging culture, we had the idea that it would be fun, and others have asked us to talk through, analyze, discuss this important movie. How should we think of it? How should we think of it as its own product, as an adaptation, in relation to Chris Nolan's filmography as a whole? So that's what we're here doing. I do want to say from the get-go that if you've not seen the movie, and you don't want to have any spoilers, you might choose not to listen any further until you've seen the movie, and then come back and see what we have to say if you want. Aiden, Phil, do you have anything that you would like to say from the get-go before we jump in?
I don't think I have anything. I mean, been a Chris Nolan fan ever since I knew what movies were, so this is exciting.
That I think is a testament to your good upbringing,
That's right.
which brings us to Phil Lytle.
Yeah, I'm just very happy that you invited me to do this. I can't really take all the credit for Aiden being a huge Nolan fan. I did introduce him to a few Nolan movies, but his his passion and his like intense love of Nolan as a filmmaker, it's not that I don't agree with him, but that's something that Aiden sort of developed on his own once he started really falling in love with movies. So I'll take credit for it if people want to give me credit because well, put myself on the back for that, but honestly, other than like the Dark Knight trilogy, I'm not really sure how many Nolan movies I have watched with Aiden. But I was like, this is you need to watch Nolan. This is the best. Aiden sort of like kind of went on his own for that one. So
Awesome. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you for sharing that. Well, I think I'll just start with this question to you all. Initial thoughts about the Odyssey. We'll get into some of the technical stuff, the form stuff, the content stuff, the cultural controversy stuff on the left and the right. But just first impressions. What did you think?
Um, First impressions, I was just kind of overwhelmed by the experience of seeing it. I mean, I saw it in IMAX on opening night, and just how loud everything was, how just lost you kind of were in the scale of everything. It left me just completely speechless in that regard, but it also left me with kind of like I don't really know how else to put this, but just interesting things to think about. Like I didn't leave with an immediate like star 1 to 5 star review or scale of 1 to 10. It left me kind of just with a lot to ponder and a lot to think about, kind of how I view it in terms of in and of its own thing, but then also in scope of everything else that Nolan has done. So
So initially, did you like it? Did you dislike it?
yeah. Initially, I liked it. I liked it. As it stands now, and this gets into a little bit more of the weeds. It's kind of in the middle of Nolan's 13 movies for me. Just kind of falls somewhere. It's like lower, kind of in that middle third, I guess, if you were divided into thirds. But still, I mean, he's my favorite filmmaker, and I like all of his movies. So that's not a bad thing about the movie. It's just not quite as good as some of his others.
So some context for those who are listening. Aiden and I regularly analyze movies, and so we have not previously discussed our thoughts on this movie. So it's going to be really interesting to see to what extent our opinions and our takes line up. And not too infrequently, our takes line up fairly consistently. So so right now, I'm exactly the same in that I place it in that middle third
Hmm.
of how I would rank his filmography. Right now, maybe middle third to upper. a middle third to upper middle third, depending on how you. So I'm toying with whether I think it's number 4 or 5 on my list. So it's not the
Okay.
top echelon,
Yeah.
but I can say for me, I want to watch it again. I'm not going to
Right.
watch it in the theater probably, but I want to watch it again. Um, some movies have the effect like you really enjoy them when you first see them, but then as time wears on, they don't quite sit as well in your mind as
Hmm.
time goes on. This movie has had the opposite effect. Like the
Right.
more I sit with it, the more I just find that I'm more impressed with it. So tentatively, it's probably in the upper part of that middle third. Not top three, maybe not top four,
Hmm.
but on that, you and I are agreed. I would also agree with you, and this has happened numerous times with the Nolan movie. I try to go into it having not watched many trailers, having not seen as much of anything as I can regarding pre-production, production, even avoiding the critics and
Hmm.
the takes because I want to go into it as it were in a way that's pure and form my own opinion. Um, and then I leave it and I just need to sit with it a while to
Right.
figure out what I think. Which, when you've got a filmmaker who can just make you sit with something and you don't have an immediate sort of I loved it, I hated it reaction,
Hmm.
it says, I don't know, something profound about what they're able to do. But anyway, Phil, what about you?
So I feel like I'm kind of coming into this whole conversation a little bit like half prepared because I typically don't like to really form any sort of like really strong opinions about a movie until I've seen it a couple of times, particularly if it's a movie that I think is worth examining. Like there are plenty of movies I watched once and I know like, okay, that's not for me. Or that was a fun movie, but it's not a movie that I'm going to think about a lot.
Hmm.
Nolan movies you want to like to me they're worth spending time thinking about. And so I've only seen it once. So I kind of do feel like I'm a little bit like I don't really quite have my head around everything that I think about it. I walked out of the theater thinking this is a movie that definitely deserves to be seen. It's a movie that deserves to be seen on the big screen. I think if you care about film at all, you should watch it on the biggest screen you can find. I was not able to see it in the IMAX because all the showings were sold out for like 3 weeks, and so because I didn't get ahead of I didn't jump on the list of people buying the tickets like 7 months ago. But I did get to see it on a pretty big screen, good sound system. There were no technical issues, which sometimes you run into in theaters. But I walked out just kind of my brain was kind of going a lot of different directions. Like I really appreciated the movie in the scale and in sort of the story that he was trying to tell, but I also felt somewhat disconnected from the characters in a sense that I don't really feel like I knew everybody as much as I would want to. That possibly would be helped by watching it again.
Hmm.
Um, because especially a movie like this, and this happens a lot with these bigger movies that are ambitious in scope or scale or whatever. Like it takes me a while to sort of adjust to what the filmmaker's trying to do. Like so, I need to start listening to the vocabulary that the filmmaker's using, and that takes a while. So I don't necessarily connect with it as deeply on an emotional level on the first viewing as I would in subsequent viewings.
Hmm.
So I'm kind of with you guys as far as where it lands for me for Nolan films. It's definitely kind of it's sort of in the middle of his career. Probably based on what you guys said, probably a little lower than you guys have it, but definitely a movie again. Like I said, it deserves to be seen. If you care about film at all, you should go watch this movie. And I'm guessing most people that care about film have watched it since it's made $1 billion or almost. So people clearly aren't shying away from the movie. So
Right.
I liked it, but
Yeah.
I'm still my thoughts are kind of all over the place right now about it.
Unlike many of his movies, how do I want to say this? For the first half of the movie, it really is quite episodic. And it really doesn't begin to coalesce and come together in a coherent way, if that's the best way to say it, and until about halfway through. Prior to that point, it's episodic. It's various people telling different stories that sort of go together. but sort of getting into its rhythm does take a minute, and maybe it detracts from identifying with these characters as much as you would like because of the way the story is being told. So I can relate to that definitely. I can relate to that definitely. My
which
Go ahead.
I think that's actually part of the adaptation process. If you're adapting Homer's poem, you're it's if you do at least a semi-faithful adaptation, it is going to feel somewhat episodic.
Yes.
Um, and that's unavoidable. So unless you really wanted to change a lot about the structure and just the way the story is told, and almost make some changes that I don't think would have been worth it, you're going to have sort of that feeling that it's going to be a little episodic. So
Right.
I don't think that was avoidable for Nolan. I think you had to have that. Plus, I also feel like he wants to kind of keep you off balance for the
Yes.
first part of the movie because he wants you to be engaging with it. Because if you're not, if everything is super comfortable and you're just kind of sitting back in your reclined seat in the theater, you're not really engaging with all of the themes and the characters and everything the way he wants you to. At
Mm.
least that kind of the way I would view it.
Yeah.
Here's a question. I don't know. This may sound random. I don't know to what extent C.S. Lewis ever said this explicitly. Maybe he did, and I'm unaware of it. To what extent is something like the story, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, is the structure of that story in the book, not the movie, which is not that good, an homage to something like the Odyssey, to that tradition of storytelling? Because it's episodic,
Yeah,
and it's all different.
I would think probably on some level it is because it definitely of all the Narnia stories, it's definitely
Yeah,
it's the only one that really has that sort of episodic feel to it.
yeah, yeah.
So
Um, so let's get into the movie itself, and we can talk about its themes. We can talk about let's talk about the movie as a movie. Once we get through that, we can, unless the conversation organically moves there anyway, then we can move to sort of the cultural evaluation question, which relates to, among other things. I mean, you got it from the proverbial left and the right, in terms of the casting choices and language, as in it's not like always King's English,
Right.
to the nature of the adaptation itself, and who is the character of Odysseus really? And anyway, that's kind of the way that I see this going, but in a way to kind of organize it, categorize it. I started with Aiden last time. Let's start with Phil this time. Getting into the movie technically, you can do score, you can do themes, you can do acting, you can do practical effect. I mean, just whatever. I mean, the text of the movie itself. What do you think when you're analyzing that? What do you like? What do you struggle with?
I think well, and I think I posted this on X on Twitter on my account, but I said I think one of the great things about this movie is that it's 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 basically Nolan making a really big budget, almost like an art house film. It's weird. It's there's nothing in it that's just easy. It's not like this. He didn't make it for mass appeal, yet it has mass appeal. And to me, it's kind of makes my head spin a little bit because this is not the kind of movie. I don't know if any other director other than Nolan could make this movie exactly the way that it is and it be as successful. I think his name attached to it just already lends it so much credibility that people are just willing to engage with this story, even though it's a odd, weird, and like just the whole Greek morality, even though he tones down from what the poem is. And he definitely brings in like and I know this term is being kind of, I don't know, people are arguing about the term now. It's a little bit more of a Judeo Christian morality to some of the story. It still has a very kind of alien, almost, we don't really quite understand what these characters are thinking and how they're feeling because it's so different from what our lives are. Yet people are totally okay with it. People are just jumping right in. Like there was a movie that came out a couple of years ago, The Green Knight. I don't know if you guys saw it. Like it's a weird, strange. That movie didn't make any money.
Right.
It didn't do. Nobody cared, and not that it's not. I mean, it's got some good qualities to it. It also has some really strange stuff to it. But then you have the Odyssey, which is just this weird, strange, kind of odd movie, but people are loving it. And I think that's the testament to Nolan as a filmmaker. He can engage people even if you don't always feel like you're connecting, like I did, with the characters the way you want, you're still engaged with the story,
Right.
and you're still engaged with just the experience of it. So that to me is like the standout. Like, I mean, artistically, the cinematography is great, the acting's good across the board. The music is very interesting because there's never a moment where the music is like I'm trying to connect with your emotions with this music as far as like make you feel good about something. It's always a little bit, it's just odd. It's not very melodic, which I found interesting, yet it works for the film. He doesn't they don't try to pump any sort of artificial emotion into things. It's just, this is what it is, and you're gonna experience it the way we wanted you to. So yeah, artistically from a filmmaking perspective, I mean, it's fantastic. It's
As common as the
Nolan.
music, it's even atonal, it's very
Yeah.
unsettling.
Yeah.
And maybe that's part of the point. I mean, if you're
Yeah.
in some Greek version, I mean, if you're in Hades, in effect, or if you're with this terrible witch, revealing who you really are on the inside, I mean, yeah, this is terrible in the truest sense of that word. It invokes terror.
Right.
Um, what about you, Aiden?
Yeah. I mean, I fully agree with all that. I think out of all his films, this one, the score is intertwined kind of with the sound effects of the film in a way that I hadn't really seen before. Like, if you think the obvious example is anytime Odysseus plucks the bow, which is such a cool moment every time he does it. But whenever he does it, you don't just hear the sound of the bowstring, but you hear it kind of reverberate through the whole theater of the, how Ludwig was able to incorporate that into the score, stuff like that, I think was really impressive. I think Nolan was also very and this is kind of a loaded part of this conversation because I'll get into this in a minute, but he's very clearly, the way he talked about it in interviews, wasn't super keen on the gods having any sort of role in the movie. He wanted them to, when you talk about Poseidon, he doesn't want to show Poseidon. He wants you to be on the boat and feel the effects of what these people thought was Poseidon, who we know now isn't, to be Poseidon and things like that. And so, you're just from the filmmaking perspective, you're on the boat, you feel uncomfortable. You feel even without feeling the water, you feel the water and you feel like you're lost and you're just so enveloped in everything that's happening. And the Odyssey is something that kind of the whole just the whole scope of how people look at it. It's people remember sequences of events. People who we've all read it in high school. People remember the Cyclops and they remember the sirens and they remember the witch turning the men into pigs. And Nolan, I think, set out to just kind of capture those sequences in IMAX the best way that he can, and the best filmmaker to be able to capture something at that scope. And I think he set out to do that, and he did it really well. And so I appreciate that aspect of it. I think, you know, I don't know exactly how I feel yet about Athena, because Athena is kind of the one god throughout the whole movie. They're like, well, at least he showed her. But at the very end, you realize that it's actually kind of just this. It's psychologically grounded in a kind of an interesting way because it's this temple girl who Odysseus is kind of projecting through his trauma and his grief. And I don't know, like that's something that necessarily didn't sit right with me in a way because I think, and this is going to be true about Interstellar, which is my favorite Nolan film, but I do think Interstellar's weakest point is at the very end where Cooper's in space and he says, "Oh, the black hole was put here by future humans." Like Nolan can't help himself but include that line because he can't bring himself to just leave stuff up to the mystery or to leave stuff up to some aspect of divinity that we can't explain. He has to tick off that box. And I feel like the Odyssey is kind of indicative of that kind of thing he falls into in a lot of ways. Yeah.
So let's talk about that theme for a minute. Dunkirk. It's not about providence, it's about sheer grit, and human determination.
Right.
You mentioned Interstellar. Here we have. I have not. I read in one. This is kind of getting to the cultural point, but not the controversial cultural critical point. The opening line of the movie says something like, "In an age of apparent magic,"
Parent magic. Right.
and one review pointed out it was from Brett McCracken to give credit where credit is due. I've not double checked this for myself, so I'm taking it for granted that he's correct, and I'm not saying he's wrong at all. He's probably correct, but he says that every sequence that has a magical component to it, in effect, is told by Odysseus, who is on the lotus flower, which
Yep.
is not something that I cannot quite realized that until I read that in the review and I went, I think that's right.
Yep.
I need to double check that. That would explain like that line because I left the movie thinking, what was that line about exactly? You know,
Right.
that's what it's about. He gives
Yeah.
a human explanation for this thing. So yeah, at the end of the day, he won't let mystery be mystery. He's a bit humanist when it comes down to it. Well, let me throw some ideas for me out there. Um, as far as acting, um, everything across the board, practically everything across the board is solid. I don't know that any. Maybe I'll appreciate it more on a second viewing. Certain performances, I thought of all of it as solid, you know, to really really good. I don't know that any performance was just like standout for me. It was all just consistently solid across the board, with a few caveats, which gets into controversy, and we'll get there in a minute. As far as the writing goes, there was one line. This seems really nitpicky, but in the moment, I noticed it and it was distracting in the wrong kind of way for me. Maybe it's a me problem. But there's one line from Anne Hathaway who I really, really liked. But she said something about, I've been doing this longer than you've been able to grow whiskers on your chin or something. And I
Yep.
thought, like, I noticed it. It took me out
It
of the,
took me out of it. I know exactly what you're talking about. It's
and I
that
thought, was
that
that a
felt
bad line or was that a bad delivery?
that scene in particular felt super anachronistic in a way that a lot of the rest of the film didn't. Like Tom Holland's character is kind of, he's telling her you need to pick a suitor or you need to figure, something's got to be done about this. And she kind of goes on this little speech. She's like, well, and he calls the throne empty. And she goes, well, it's not empty. I've been sitting on that throne for 20 years. I have the knowledge to do this in a way that none of these guys have the knowledge to do it. And it's just, I don't know. To me, that took me out of it. That felt like we were watching a movie in 2026, not like we were watching a movie for a story that happened, thousands of years ago. So that I agree with that. That exact scene stuck out to me in a bad way.
Um, as far as the acting, this is honestly, shame on me, but this is the first Tom Holland movie I've seen. I have not gone down the Spider-Man orbit. The last live action Spider-Man I saw was Andrew Garfield. Um, I was really impressed with Tom Holland. I thought he did a
Yeah,
fine job. That guy's having a fantastic summer, by the way.
yeah, for real.
Yeah.
I thought that the character and performance for the Robert Pattinson character, he was very effectively written as a coward.
Oh yeah,
Robert Pattinson played it up just wonderfully.
yeah.
He was excellent. Of course, the witch, that actress, I can't think of her name.
Smith Morton, I
Samantha
think.
Martin.
Whew.
Yeah.
Man, two sequences, that one and the Cyclops scene and Hades,
Hmm.
but just as much those two scenes they're like something out of a horror movie.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Like they're terrifying. They're
Nolan's done that twice now because Oppenheimer has some moments like that, especially like when Oppenheimer kind of gives that speech after having successfully, you know, made the bomb, and he's having these flashes of just, he's seeing the people who have been turned, in his mind. I mean, Nolan has like hinted around this kind of horror element. I don't know if he'll ever make a horror movie, but it wouldn't shock me if he did, based on how much he's kind of been leaning into this recently.
for a long time, I really enjoyed the Hans Zimmer Chris Nolan relationship.
Hmm.
And I love some of those iconic soundtracks. I love the Interstellar soundtrack. I love the organs. But his partnership, I guess, for the last three movies, Tenet, Oppenheimer, and then this with Ludwig, these are really effective soundtracks.
Yeah.
They're he I'm not going to say he's better than Hans Zimmer, but he does bring something. I'm not saying he's worse, but he brings something to the in my view, but he brings something to the table that's just different from
Right.
what Hans Zimmer. It's like John Williams, you listen to John Williams and it's like that's John Williams. There are just certain John Williams staple effects approaches. Hans has the same and I'm seeing the same with Ludwig. So
Yep.
really effective score. I love the minimal CGI. It's
Hmm.
all practical effects. I mean, you've got people buried, literally buried in the ground with straws so they can breathe until they come up out of the ground, you know, in Hades.
Yeah.
Um, the Cyclops is he a giant puppet?
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah,
The
they used like a 60-foot giant puppet that they then could, cleaned up. But yeah.
the whirlwind in the whirlpool rather in
Hmm.
the sea is I think created by jet skis.
Yep.
And then the monsters, I can't think of their name after the whirlpool.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
puppetry as well,
Hmm.
as I'm understanding it. Anyway, just the practical effects are there's no green screens. I mean, they're literally hiking up mountains.
Right.
Um, the Trojan horse sequence. You and I, Aiden, saw that in a preview to another movie.
Yeah.
That is gripping, harrowing.
Yeah. Yeah.
The fact that Chris Nolan, in some ways, it's like big movie making of the 80s and early 90s, where you literally have hundreds and thousands of extras for certain scenes. There's not CGI. I mean, you're actually on location with actual people. Can you imagine being at the helm of that many people as a director? So,
Yeah.
from a purely technical standpoint, it's just, whew, it's
Yeah.
fascinating. It's impressive.
Yeah.
Um, I feel like I've been asking a lot of the questions. For where we are so far, what questions do you all have for me, if any? You don't have to have any. I just want to give you the freedom to ask me questions, specific questions, if you have them that's on point.
I don't specifically have a question for you, but both of you mentioned Nolan's sort of his humanistic, avoiding the mystery sort of tendencies in his film, and I'm curious what you thought about in the final scene, the confrontation between Odysseus and the suitors.
Hmm.
Throughout that whole sequence, you hear thunder claps, and the lightning, and anytime it happens, you start seeing people kneeling.
Hmm.
Basically, they're giving up and they're kneeling because they don't want to be executed by Odysseus, and they're not going to take part in the fight. But the thunder happens multiple times, which I've read a lot of people that are attributing that to that's Zeus speaking in that
Hmm.
moment. So I wonder if that was Nolan
Interesting.
wanting to just sort of be like, I'm gonna give you a little bit there, not
Hmm.
totally discount the fact that maybe there was some sort of sovereign at play, but also I'm not going to explicitly spell it out, even though I know where he lands personally. Leave it open in the movie at that point that maybe there's something involved there that's more than just natural, lightning and thunder happening outside while Odysseus is taking care of business at home. So I don't know, thoughts if you guys noticed that or what you thought about
I had not noticed it. I had not read that. That's a really interesting insight, and it sounds reasonable to me. And it's one that I look forward to noticing when I watch it again. So it's almost like
that.
it's as if Nolan is saying, "Yeah, these stories are told through the lens of Odysseus on the lotus flower, but then there's a tipping of the hat, maybe that there is a bit of mystery, perhaps, in the universe." Even if I want to explain it all the way, some I have enough humility to recognize I can't explain everything away. Maybe that's part
Right.
of what he's trying to say. That's a good insight. I don't know. What do you think, Aiden?
Yeah, I don't know. I hadn't noticed that. I hadn't noticed that either, but that's something definitely to pay attention to when I see it. I'm seeing it again in 2 days, so we'll see when I see it again on Wednesday. But yeah.
Well, will this be like what your third, fourth?
No,
What
just
is
a
this?
second. Just a second.
Okay.
It's no
Okay.
Tenet that I saw 4 times in IMAX,
Which is
but
insane, by the way. I mean,
worth
nobody
every
saw
penny.
Tenet. Nobody saw Tenet more in the theater than Aiden Leonard.
No, it didn't make any money. I was half that movie's box office earnings,
It was
but
a difficult time for movies.
yeah, it was.
If I had to summarize the thesis of the thematic material, feel free to argue with me. Tell me if I'm wrong. Tell me if you see it in a different way, a more nuance, with different nuance. The movie seems to be um, about how does a man, how do I want to say this? It seems to be about we contribute to the downfall of civilization. We can be the reverse of the downfall of civilization, and it starts with me being a better and more virtuous person.
Hmm.
Does that seem to be the thesis of the movie to you all?
Yeah, I would say. I mean, I,
Yeah.
this whole idea of Zeus's law, like Nolan reframes it in a way that's it's almost verbatim the golden rule. I mean, the idea of Zeus's law being treat anyone, treat any traveler with respect because they may be a god in disguise. But the way the dialogue is written throughout the movie, I mean, he almost says multiple times, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you," in a very explicit way. That I don't even know if that was intentional or not. It probably wasn't. But I don't know. I think I would agree with that being kind of the central point. Especially with how Nolan's been obsessed with the whole nonlinear storytelling throughout his whole career. And this one, I think it was used effectively kind of to speak to that theme that you're talking about because it starts with Odysseus not being there, and then it's kind of retold through various segments of him on that island eating the lotus flower, and then it all kind of comes together at the end, like we've talked about. So, I think I would agree with that.
Yeah, for sure. And I thought the whole Zeus's law thing and the way he reframed Zeus's law, where it like Aiden said, it matches up really well with the golden rule. Like that's to me, and it's been I hadn't read the Odyssey since like '96. I did my research paper about Odysseus in World Lit at Welch College. Shout out to Welch. Um, and I haven't read it since. And I didn't, for whatever reason, I didn't want to read it again right before watching the movie because I didn't want to go into the movie just kind of like looking for all the ways that it matches up. So I may be forgetting this, but I don't remember the poem really dealing a lot with Odysseus struggling with sort of like the shame and the grief and like the feelings of like he did something wrong
Yeah,
in the war. And what he did in coming up with the Trojan horse and all of that was a betrayal of Zeus's law. Like it that doesn't happen in the poem, and it the fact that Nolan felt like that was the central theme and he needed to include that. I mean, it tells you that he views the ethics and the morality of the ancient world is not good enough, that something is better. And the thing that he latches onto that's better is the Judeo Christian morality to an extent, which I just hope that he continues to pursue that thought because then maybe that'll push him closer to what the actual truth is. But yeah, it's definitely, we need to become more virtuous. Like,
right.
but how do you do that when you don't have any sort of connection to something that's greater than you outside of you? When if there's no God that's influencing this, where do you draw that virtue from? So
And yeah, and I don't know that he would probably deny that, but I mean, I think it was Ben Shapiro who went on Bill Maher's show and he's like, why is it that you, an atheist, and me, a practicing Jew, agree on 90% of morality? It's because we were both born on third base on
yeah,
a civilization built on thousands of years of scripture. That's why we agree 95% of the time. I think with Nolan it's the same way, whether he's aware of it or not.
yeah,
To your point, Phil, earlier, maybe the increased thunder in that final scene or sequence is him tipping his hat to maybe there has to be something bigger, even if I can't explain it.
Yeah.
Um, there, and it's not just the golden rule that's echoed; it's also the echo of be kind to people, be kind to strangers. You don't know who you don't know who you're attending in that moment. It
yeah,
could be the scriptures would say an angel.
right.
The movie says a god, but it's
Right.
thematically the same type of thing there. So yeah, so for the people who are conservatives who are getting upset with the movie, if you look at the movie itself, like we can talk about the adaptation and casting choices and all that, but like at its heart, it seems to be about what does it mean to be a person of virtue and
Yep.
improve yourself. And maybe Nolan means something slightly different. To use I think you said 90% the same. You were comparing
Hmm.
Marr and Shapiro. Yeah, maybe why do we have 90% overlap? I mean, so maybe there's a slight disagreement about what we mean about virtue,
Right.
but we want to be virtuous. We want to be a virtuous people. Well, let's get into it if you want. What did you all think about some of the controversial things? Or would you prefer me to go first since I've been sort of throwing the questions at you?
Go right ahead.
I will start with I'll start with the casting stuff. In my ideal world, um, characters are patterned off of people,
Right.
and people are, among other things, flesh and blood. We are men, we're women, we have different skin pigmentations. We are not Neoplatonic or Platonic in the way that we view the material world. So once you establish a given character, that character is established as that character. So for me personally, I prefer, in my ideals, not to be, for lack of a better word, Gnostic in the way that I think about characters. Once you have an established character, that character is that character. So, um, Severus Snape is a white man, an English man, and so on and so forth. Actually, I think the way Spider-Man did it, speaking of Spider-Man, I think that the way they handled it was in a way brilliant, maybe unintentional, but Peter Parker is a white dude. They didn't recast Peter Parker as a brown dude. They created a new character that was of Spider-Man type that they called Miles Morales. Does that
Right.
make sense what I'm saying? So in
Yep.
my ideal world, established characters are established characters because characters by definition are more than mere types. If you
Hmm.
were establishing mere types, then you could maybe play around a little bit more with some of these elements, but characters as such are characters. They're not simply types. So in my ideal world, the casting would have been true to the types that they are. Um, I'm not living in an ideal world. So, I guess just to put it bluntly, would I have rather Helen of Troy been as she's described in the poem? Yeah, I would have. But I'm not personally going to get upset about Helen of Troy's casting and not get upset about practically everyone else because I don't know that there's anyone on that casting that's Greek. You've
Right.
got people who are Mexican, I think, or Anglo or
Right.
Gaulish. I don't know all these people's exact descendancy, but the point is there's some version of Anglo or Saxon or Indian. You've got an Indian guy
Hmm.
on there. But the point is they're not Greek. So at the end of the day, I'm kind of like Shapiro's take. This is not going to be a thing that bothers me all that much. It's
Yeah.
not how I would prefer it in my ideal world, but
Yep.
I'm not given $250 million to make the movie, so I have to choose my battles, so to speak.
Yep.
So that's
Yeah,
kind of my take on that piece of the casting thing.
Hmm.
What do you guys think about that?
yeah, I think that's kind of where I would land as well. I don't. I kind of feel like for for most stories that are going to be told now, particularly something that's got any sort of foot in like fantasy or mythology, the filmmakers they're gonna. It's almost they don't really have a choice with the way actors unions work and the way that just the people view it. They have to have more representation on screen,
Well, and to be nominated
and
for an Oscar, you have to check a certain list.
you have to. And so I I've just sort of come to terms with like it's not something. This is not a hill worth dying on. It's not something that I'm gonna like
Yeah.
just beat the drum and be like this is unacceptable. And it bothered me when the early conversation was that they had cast the actress for Helena Troy Lupita,
Hmm.
and people just came out so strongly against that. And it reminded me of a lot of the controversy early on with Rings of Power when it was being announced and you were seeing pictures of, well, there's a black lady who's playing a dwarf, and
Hmm.
there are hobbits or hobbit-like creatures, the Harfoots, that have multiple races. And as much as people want to argue that it's not, there isn't some uh, sort of racist ideology behind it. The people that tend to argue it with it the most and have the most problem with it, eventually, if you pull away enough layers, you start to get a lot of racial invectives from them. And it so to me, it's not just you're not arguing for like a consistency or like telling the story the way the author intended. It becomes something more than that, and that's always kind of bothered me. So I'm of the opinion that when it something like this that's set in a world that yes, it's Greek, and I get that, but there's also mythology involved, and it's somewhat has a fantastical feel to it. I'm not going to hold on to everybody has to be Greek and everybody has to look this way. It's not. It's really not that big of a deal to me, and I'm willing to accept the characters as the film portrays them. And I thought, Helen of Troy was fine. She did a good job.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I kind of approached it. I approached it hesitant because I was nervous. Not that Nolan has showed any signs of doing anything like this previously, but I was nervous that a casting decision was made with the sole purpose of kind of subverting what you thought was
Right.
going to happen. And I think subversions 99% of the time don't work and they're problematic.
Right.
I don't think, but this didn't turn out to be that. It was just a casting choice, you know. I think, but for example, like with you mentioned Snape, which hasn't come out yet, but like to me, if they cast the guy they cast for that and they rewrite his whole backstory for James and his friends to be just raging racists against Snape, that becomes a problem because that fundamentally changes how you view Harry and how you view his parents and how you view just the whole world. You know what I mean? Which hasn't happened
Right.
yet, so I don't want to critique that. But I was nervous for this one. There was going to be some element of that where there's some element of Helen of Troy being the most beautiful woman in the world, and it's because she's different or exotic in this specific way. But to me there wasn't anything out of like in that way that took me out of the movie. It was just the casting choice, and at the end of the day, that's kind of what's going to happen. Like you had said from here on out. So
It sounds to me like our opinions have a certain commonality, to
mhm.
them. So for me, just to be clear, I've got my ideals, but then to your point, Phil, we're not living in an ideal world, and at the end of the day, it's not a hill I'm gonna die on. And frankly, just to be clear about what I mean and what I don't mean, the sort of person that's embarrassing to me is the sort of person who gets mad at the Helen of Troy casting, but isn't mad at all about the Odysseus casting or anybody else in the movie. That strikes me as inconsistent because you can't be mad about the one and not mad about the other uh, if it's really about how these people were actually described. But to your point, you peel back enough layers, and it's like there's some racial undertones to your critique that I'm uncomfortable with. If that's kind of the direction you're going with your critique.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
the idea that I'm completely fine with Matt Damon casting, but not this other woman. So yeah, at the end of the day, it's not something I'm gonna lose sleep over and cause me not to like the movie.
Right.
So let's get to the other casting question. What do we think about the person formerly known as Ellen Page, who now goes by Elliot Page? What do we think about this?
It's a good question. Um, that and maybe this is just the way I'm looking at it. I think I texted this to Dad, but like I felt like every line that and I mean she's in it for 2 minutes, but every line she gave in Hades was her like really trying to sound like a guy, and she doesn't sound like a guy to me, you know? And she's just confused and heartbreakingly lost. But that took me out of it. I saw some guy who's conservative. He said, you know, Nolan, where else are you going to find kind of a 90-pound guy who can play that role of someone who really can't fight but who needs to be sacrificed kind of in the way that that character was sacrificed? And he had worked, Nolan worked with the same actors just over and over again, and that kind of just fell into his lap in that way. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
I've
If that
oh, go ahead, please.
No, I was just gonna say if that was the reason why Nolan had cast Page in that role, then that would actually make sense because he somebody he's worked with before, somebody he trusts, put them in a role, and the character that they're playing is somebody who shouldn't be going to war, physically shouldn't be there, um,
Right.
can't do the job, and then is basically a sacrificial lamb,
Yeah.
just to sell the Trojan horse. They need somebody there that they're not going to need, which I don't know. That feels very almost like it feels cynical that Nolan would do that. And I don't know. So I don't know what the reasoning behind any of it is. But yeah, it's almost a blink and you miss it kind of role. So there's
Right.
a couple of there's that scene and there's the scene in Hades, and the scene in Hades obviously a little bit more there as
Hmm.
far as acting, but it's to me it didn't have like a major effect on the story because it's so brief, and I was just can move to the next scene and you kind of understand what's going on. And so again, the expectation is that this sort of thing is probably going to happen, and sometimes you're just going to have to kind of like deal with. Like, I wouldn't have chosen this person in this role, but
Right.
you can't. I'm also not going to completely just throw out a film or a show or whatever just because of one decision that's made that honestly is very inconsequential to the overall story.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's realism. We don't live in a perfect world, so if we're gonna throw stuff out because we there's something wrong with it, well then we're not gonna engage in much of anything because of the world we live in. Of the Daily Wire guys, I didn't look at any of their stuff until after I'd seen the movie. And in order, I preferred Ben Shapiro's take, then Michael Knowles, then Matt Walsh was the most, no offense, but just ridiculous. And Shapiro said that it was an unforced error, I think was the phrase that he used.
Mm,
And I can resonate with that take.
yeah.
It's sort of like the whiskers on the chin line. Whenever
Right.
whenever she would appear on screen, it kind of took me out of the movie.
Hmm.
And maybe if I didn't know anything about the controversy, maybe I wouldn't have noticed it. But I kind of think that I would have noticed it because she doesn't sound like a man. She sounds like someone trying to sound like a man. So it's just a bit distracting in the wrong kind of ways. So not enough to make me boycott the movie personally, to echo you, Phil, but uh, but just something that makes reminds me we're in 2026, which is
Yeah.
not exactly what you want. So that was kind of my take.
Yep.
Did the some people criticized the language use of words like daddy and this kind of thing? Did this sort of stuff bother you all, or
It didn't bother me at all.
no,
it did
I
not?
find that I find it interesting that people will prefer, like you said, what was it, the King's English,
Mhm.
when you're having a film that's set like an ancient story being told. Why is that better? Like they weren't speaking the King's English in the poem. There's no reason why the adaptation that comes out now should have that same sort of feel, or even like, to me the language wasn't an issue. There were only a couple of lines, and it wasn't really the language that was being employed. It was the actual words that they were using. Like the line about the end of the Bronze Age, is that our age of bronze,
Hmm.
like that Odysseus says late in the film. I felt that was just way too on the nose, and like would they have been like cognizant of the fact that they were in the Bronze Age? Like,
Hmm.
is that like a thing that people would have talked about then? Like, it was like
Right.
I would really love to hear Nolan explain why he decided to include that in, because it just felt like it was a commentary outside of the reality of the story we were watching.
Hmm.
Like, I'm just going to make this statement right now about kind of what's happening. I'm like, no, we don't. You don't need that. Like, you've already given us enough information about how the world is sort of going a bad direction because of the things that have happened, and so we don't need kind of that on the nose sort of wording. But the language itself wasn't a problem. It felt natural to the characters. It felt like it worked for the story that he was telling. So
I agree. I read reviews on the right, and sadly, sometimes the right is embarrassing. I'm sorry to say.
oh, for sure.
But I read some things on the right that criticize the language. It's not enough King's English. But I literally read certain things on the left that criticize the movie for having too much King's English.
Yeah.
And it's just interesting how you get to the extremes on both sides, and
Right.
they are sometimes both equally ridiculous in their ways. And sometimes their critiques actually begin to curve in on one another,
Yeah.
like a horseshoe, effect. They actually start to get they start to get closer. And so it's like you got people on the right who are like, or the so-called right, however you want to think about it. This is too left for this reason, but you've got somebody like the Emily Wilson, is that her name?
Hmm.
Translation. Her review criticized the movie for not having enough sex, for having too much man in it, too much apology for man in it. It wasn't transgressive enough for her, you know, but it was too non-traditional for people on the right, and it's just like, ay, ay, ay.
Right.
Not all people on the right, not most people on the right, perhaps, but
The
there's
loud people.
allowed people.
A lot,
Yes.
yeah. And that's a bigger conversation than just the Odyssey, but I think it points to the fact that so much of this, particularly online discourse, like if you have conversations with people that this is the kind of stuff we're people aren't having those kind of extreme reactions, at least not the people that I know.
Right.
But the online discourse, it's all built upon extreme responses to things. And so if you're going to have a problem with this movie, you've got to take a really strong stance on it on one side or the other. And I don't believe most of the people that are taking those sides believe half of what they're saying.
Yeah.
I think it's just a matter because the louder voices get the most attention and they get the most engagement, and so it creates it creates a sort of a system where you can't actually have productive conversations about stuff. Like you
Right.
can't have now if there were three, well, there's three of us today that are talking about this movie right now, and we all sort of have the same sort of feelings about it. We all have similar responses to it. But if there was one person here who was coming down much more negatively on the film, but still had the same sort of temperament as us, I feel like we could have a very productive conversation without jumping to these extremes that what social media tends to encourage. And so it's so hard to listen to any of it because I don't believe any of it actually is genuine and it's not good faith by most of those people. So it drowns out any voices that are just normal people that are saying, yeah, I like parts of it. I didn't like this. And then you can't say that now. You have to have, it was the best thing ever, or it was woke, or it was the most, it's tiring.
Yeah.
They are either grifting, to your point, or they're actually that miserable. And
Right.
either option is not altogether encouraging
Yeah.
there. Well, let me jump in with this. As an adaptation, as an adaptation, you mentioned, Phil, you don't remember Odysseus having this internal struggle and this kind of thing. Some people are upset about the adaptation as an adaptation because it's not, in their words, faithful to the original. But this raises an interesting question. We don't have to spend long here. I want to be sensitive to our time. But if you look at the history of the way that these characters have been dealt with through the history of, say, Western civilization, you could argue all kinds of people. You could argue that Dante, you could argue that Shakespeare um, adapted these characters and the way these characters had been built, not strictly from it's the source material, but had been built over the course of Western civilization. You could argue that they ran with that and continued a certain trajectory that that had been established for them that if you were being super, super, super strict about it, you'd have to say, well, that's not technically what Homer did with this character or whatever, Dante. Now, on the one hand, I don't want to conflate a certain revisionism of today with what Shakespeare and Dante are doing, but I'm saying just because an adaptation is an adaptation doesn't mean that it's inappropriate within the context of the way that stories and themes and characters are developed over the course of a tradition, a civilization, over the course of a civilization. Does that seem reasonable, or am I crazy? Or like, in other words, are we okay with this adaptation as it's been adapted by and large?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you look at just like book sales, I mean, the Odyssey is being sold in quantities it has not been sold before since the online world has started tracking these things because of what Nolan has put on the screen and how big his name is, how he's bringing people back to the text, which is always a good thing. But then just as an adaptation in and of itself, yeah, I agree.
I suppose a question that I'm really trying to get at is what Nolan has done as an adaptation altogether different from the type of thing that Shakespeare did and that Dante did with these characters in their ways?
I don't know. I lean towards no, but it's hard to compare because film is such a new medium in the grand scope of how we've viewed kind of how the way stories have been told throughout, starting with Odyssey coming towards today. But I think I read one reviewer online say Nolan, Nolan's a filmmaker down to the marrow in his bones. That's just what he was born to do. That's what he'll always do. And this was a Nolan film in every sense of the word that was inspired by the Odyssey more than it was a strict page for page adaptation of the Odyssey. And I think I agree with that.
What do you think,
Yeah,
Phil?
and I think that to me, I don't want to say this is the blueprint for how you should adapt ancient works, because I do feel like maybe there's other ancient works that you should be more faithful to the actual themes of the ancient work, because I do feel like Nolan, like we've already discussed, he sort of imbues it with a lot of more modern um, Judeo-Christian values than what the original poem would have had. So I wouldn't want to use it as a blueprint and say everybody needs to follow Nolan's footsteps here, and this is how you adapt works. But on the other hand, I'm glad Nolan adapted this work this way because I felt like it gave it new life, and it exposed people to something that it's hilarious to me that people that watch the movie and then they see the opening of, I don't remember what studio it is that has Odysseus shooting arrow through the, there was
Mm.
one studio and people were like, oh, that's Odysseus. I didn't know,
Yeah.
they didn't know that until they watched this movie. And I'm like, well, that's a little sad, but I'm glad that now we know it. And so now go back and read some of the ancient texts and these old classic stories and poems that have have basically been part of like just how our culture has evolved and how it's developed from an artistic perspective. Like so many of our stories have been influenced by these. So
Mm.
Nolan decided to do an adaptation that was like Aiden said. This was his version based on the inspiration of the text, but not really a super word for word faithful adaptation of the story. And I'm okay with that. But another filmmaker with different worldview and different sensibilities, I might struggle with their adaptation if they're not more faithful to the text. So
Right.
it depends on who the filmmaker is, because I think some of them, like Aiden said earlier about subverting things, for some filmmakers, that's their whole purpose, is they want to subvert what the original purpose said. I don't really think Nolan is necessarily subverting Homer.
No, no.
I think he's just drawing inspiration from Homer, but
Right.
then wanting to kind of tell his own sort of version of it.
And
Yep.
infusing it with
And
the best meaning it can
there's
have.
a fine line. Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
So here's an anecdote. Like, you know me well enough to know I don't believe in reader response theory of interpretation. I don't believe in sort of deconstructionism in the way that it's taught in the 20th century and beyond. Here's an anecdote. Paul preaches a sermon in Acts 17. And in that sermon, he says, "In him we move and live," and the old translation says, "have our being." You might more literally render it, "exist." We move and live and exist in him. "For don't you know we also are his children?" So those are two lines. Both lines are quotations from pagan poets.
Hmm.
Both lines are, those poets directed those lines originally toward Zeus. So the original Greek poet, pagan poet, who said, "In him we move and live and exist," he's talking about Zeus. Don't you know we also are his children? He's talking about Zeus. What does Paul do? I don't think Paul's a deconstructionist at all. I don't think that Paul's doing reader response theory at all. Uh, but he's doing something. I don't have time. We don't have time to develop exactly what Paul is doing. But it's very nuanced and it's very sophisticated. And whilst Nolan is not Paul, you could argue that Nolan is doing something similar to what Paul is doing, infusing, uh, turning the Greek tales into a better version of what they could be from a more accurate Judeo-Christian perspective. What do you think of that take? In terms of thinking about adaptation. In other words,
Yeah.
what's Paul doing in terms of adaptation in that sermon?
Right. No,
All
I'm
that
more
Holy
than
Scripture,
comfortable.
you know?
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, I'm more than comfortable. I think I hadn't thought of that specific example, but I think that kind of goes hand in hand with what we were saying with how, he's incorporated the just some structure and some plot points and just the overarching narrative into kind of the way that the world is seen today and the way that he views stuff. So yeah.
I,
Idols?
and I don't
Go
know if
ahead.
Nolan would say this. I feel like at least maybe Nolan at this is something that just popped in my head, so it's probably totally out of left field and not well developed. I, we understand the world better now than Homer would have, or whoever, whatever the stories that sort of inspired Homer to write his poem. Like we also understand the value of like human life and dignity more than they would have then, and I'm okay with Nolan sort of incorporating that knowledge and what we know now into his adaptation, which does change some of what Homer wrote, but
Right.
it doesn't subvert it or turn it upside down or even mock it. It's just
Yes.
we've we've learned things, and
Right.
most of that is through because we have exposure to scripture,
Right.
and because of scripture's influence on Western culture. That's why we know those things. Homer wouldn't have known those things, so we do now. And whether Nolan believes these things or not, he doesn't. But it's saturated in everything that he has been brought up learning. So he's been exposed to it throughout his entire life. Whether or not he accepts it on like a personal level, it's just part of who he is. He was
Yeah.
born on third base, and
Right.
so that's going to get incorporated into his story. And I think to me, I would rather see that version of the Odyssey than see a version that's just wanting to be completely faithful to the text, because it would feel very harsh and alien and awful,
Yeah, I
honestly.
mean, I'm comfortable not seeing Odysseus and his men plunder and pillage various small places and doing things you don't want to see on the big screen because that necessarily affects how you view these characters. If these are the characters you're rooting for, with how we view the world now, you don't want to watch those things, because then you see everyone as a bad guy in a very strict sense. So yeah, I agree.
You're okay with not seeing Odysseus on an island for 7 years doing what he probably did for 7 years on an island?
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
I, I'm getting at a principle here. So in terms of my hermeneutic, Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says, "I came not to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them." I
Hmm.
came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Not one jot or tittle is to be taken away. In other words, Christianity brings, the truth brings the fullest and the best meaning of a thing that it can have. And it fills it up, you know? And just as with respect to special revelation, particular revelation, Jesus brings it to its fullest point. The same principle can apply to God's work in general revelation too, which would therefore include the arts. And it seems to me that's in effect what we're talking about here as we talk about the nature of adaptation and how the Christian ought to think about it, which actually gets us into what I think Paul is doing in Acts chapter 17.
Hmm.
It's not that sort of deconstructionist postmodern revisionism reader response stuff. It is a recognition that God is working in the world and that all truth is God's truth. And to use Augustine's phrase, and that there are things that are written by pagans that have truth elements in them, but Christianity is able to lift them up.
Yep.
Yep.
Well, this has been exceedingly fun, Lytles. Do you have any final observations or questions for me, or any final things you want to say?
No. I think in the scope of his filmography, I found it very connected to Oppenheimer. Thematically, he's dealing with a lot of the same things. The way that Oppenheimer was kind of dealing with the shame and the consequences of what he had done. I think Nolan's kind of done that throughout his career, though, and I think we've talked about this, how he's kind of made these companion films that are paired with each other. And I felt this to be just the natural successor to his previous work, and so I'm excited to see whatever he does next to start something new.
It may not be his best film, but it is among his most ambitious because um, he's tackling the nature of civilization.
Yep.
That's a big, big topic.
Right.
And his ultimate conclusion is the way that you start toward contributing to a better civilization is by being a better man yourself.
Yep.
It's a good place to start that
Yeah.
conversation.
Yep.
Any final words, Phil?
No, no, I enjoyed it. I felt honestly coming in, I was like, what are we going to say? Do I have more than like two things to say? And it ended up actually working out okay. So thank you guys for your contribution.
Well, thank you guys. Absolutely loved it and look forward to uh, seeing you guys around.